August 3rd, 2000, several quiet suburban towns in Bergen County, New Jersey fell into panic as a string of brutal murders plagued the once peaceful neighborhoods. It all began with the discovery of two bodies near the banks of a lake, found in the early morning hours. One body was male, the other female, believed to have been a couple. From that point on, it seemed bodies were being uncovered like clockwork, each and every one murdered in completely different manners. The public was adamant on saying every murder was a result of a single serial killer, but investigators were inclined to disagree as each and every body discovered had been killed by completely different means. With no motive, no singular method of murder, and very little evidence to be found, it seemed that investigators had no clue where to even begin. Ramapo Lake, a man-made body of water in Oakland, New Jersey, has been the perfect location for anyone that enjoys the beauty of woodland areas. On one particular cool morning during the late summer of 2000, a trio of joggers along the northwest bank stumbled upon a horrific sight. The bodies were of Charles and Cheryl Wilson, a recently married couple that had been spending time at the lakeside. They were discovered side by side, facing down in the dirt. Both had been bound by plastic clothesline and had suffered multiple deadly stab wounds done by a 7-inch knife.
Wilson had suffered 6 distinct stab wounds to the upper back, left side, 5 of which had punctured through to the vital organs. His wife, Cheryl, suffered 10 total, all along her back. Both died from blood loss as a result of their lungs and hearts being punctured multiple times. In both cases, it appeared as if the stab wounds were made kind of slow, methodical, like whoever made them was either choosing very particular places to stab or was counting them.
There was nothing else at the crime scene other than 2 strands of long, light brown hair caught in one of the stab wounds and a single yellow sticky note pinned by a thumbtack haphazardly to a nearby tree. Upon it was a simple target-like symbol hastily scratched in blue pen.
So upon first being called to the scene, I could tell right off the bat that there was very little to go off of, not at first glance. The bodies had all their clothing and identification on them, which was how we knew who they were immediately. Aside from that, no shoe prints could be found, no skin, no nails that didn't belong to either of the victims, no fingerprints on either the pin or the sticky note that was on this crime scene, nothing significant. The 2 hair strands found in one of the wounds were the only things we had, and they were both telogen hairs. Essentially getting significant DNA from them would be impossible. So my immediate guess was that while the killer was bringing the knife back, they must have cut a couple of their own loose hairs, which in turn ended up in the wound of the victim. And as for the sticky note with the target, I knew very well that I had seen it at some point before. It wasn't until later that I recognized the symbol on the sticky note was very similar to the one used by the Zodiac killer. So I was terrified at the idea that it could repeat again.
Upon closer inspection of the bodies, it was determined that Charles and Cheryl had been dead for nearly 24 hours. The bodies were on the verge of rigor mortis at the time of discovery. Examination of the clothesline used to tie them up revealed Cheryl's fingerprints all over the length of line used to tie Charles, but there were no fingerprints on the length used on Cheryl herself.
After further investigation of the bits of evidence we did have, the case was becoming very similar to the attack on Brian Hartnell and the murder of Cecilia Shepard in 1969. They were two of the Zodiac Killer's victims, and the victims we had on our hands were also a young couple, and their bodies were found by a lake, and the wife was likely forced to tie up her husband before she was tied herself. Even the number of stab wounds on each body matched the numbers on the victims of the Zodiac Killers. The only difference was that in our case was that both our victims were murdered, and we weren't the ones to assume things, especially not in an investigation, but it was safe to say that the killer of Cheryl and Charles Wilson likely forced Cheryl to tie Charles up at gunpoint before being tied up herself. Still, even with that, we couldn't go forward, not right off the bat.
Speaking with friends and family of the victims yielded no definitive answers as to who or why someone would murder Cheryl and Charles Wilson. The couple had been living a calm and typical middle-class life in Oakland, with no enemies to speak of. The couple was well liked by their peers, and had mentioned to a neighbor a week prior to their death that they would be going to Ramapo Lake for a day trip on August 2nd. Examination of 2 strands of hair found at the crime scene determined that they were not a close match to those of anyone the couple knew. All circumstances pointed to their murders being random, with no one related to them that would have been willing or capable of killing them. Investigators were stumped as to who could possibly be a suspect. They had already hit a wall. August 23, 2000. Residents across the many townships of Bergen County are still in a state of shock in the wake of the brutal murders of Charles and Cheryl Wilson. After the media releases startling comparisons between their murders and those done by the Zodiac Killer in 1969, the community was on edge. It seemed everyone was expecting the worst to come of this apparent copycat, and investigators were keeping an eye out for any suspicious activity that even vaguely resembled the actions of the original Zodiac Killer. However, no amount of surveillance could have prepared the residents of Ridgewood, New Jersey for what would be discovered on the banks of the Goffle Brook. A mangled body was discovered, half submerged in the water from the waist down, face down in a muddy patch with legs snagged on jagged rocks on the riverbed. It was of an adolescent African-American boy between the ages of 12 and 14. He had been stripped of nearly all clothing aside from plain white boxer shorts, and his legs were being rapidly degraded by the rocks and rushing water. No immediate causes of death could be identified.
It was only after the autopsy that the cause of death could, be determined. Evidence of severe bruising was found on 2 particular points on the neck. Along with the bruising, it was found that the windpipe and the arteries had been almost completely flattened. These were consistent injuries sustained by someone put into a violent headlock. The victim died as a result of asphyxia. He was choked to death from behind by someone who knew how to put people in an almost perfect lethal headlock.
An assault kit determined no evidence of rape. However, there were small flecks of bright red glittery nail polish on and around the groin. Identification of the body would not come until 2 days after its initial discovery, when investigators were approached by Don and Sheila McGuffin, a married couple with 3 children, at least 3 children that were with them at the time.
As it turned out, the McGuffins had issued a missing persons report 8 days prior to the body's discovery of their eldest son, Joseph McGuffin. He was 13 years old at the time of his disappearance, and the circumstances in which he had disappeared were that he had left his house later in the morning of Sunday, August 15th, on his maroon bicycle, and he was wearing a white t-shirt, and he had a blue windbreaker and baggy jeans. He told his parents before he left that he was heading to a friend's house, which was just 2 blocks down, and he was planning to spend a couple hours there. That's what he told his parents. And a couple hours went by, and the MacGuffins still hadn't heard of him. So they called a friend's house to confirm that if he was there, and they discovered that he didn't even arrive at the house. He had vanished during the 2 block span in broad daylight, with no witnesses and no sign of his bicycle or clothing. And 8 days later, a body that matched Joseph MacGuffin turns up by a river. After we discovered the body, later on we took the MacGuffins in to identify if the body was indeed Joseph MacGuffin, and it turned out it was, sadly.
Forensic entomologists discovered that Joseph had been dead for 4 days prior to discovery, but that his body had only been on the banks for just under an hour. The plain white boxer shorts that he was wearing were not even his. They had been put on him post-mortem, and a closer look at the crime scene revealed that there were partial shoe prints that had been made in the muddy silt, periodically positioned in a U shape around the top half of the body before trailing off back to the road, as evidenced by 2 imprints in the mud that led away from the scene, and 2 more transfer prints on the sidewalk at the top of the bank. These prints matched those of a pair of size 8 UGG brand boots. The fact that the prints were situated all around the body, combined with other imprints discovered in the mud and some unnatural splattering of mud found along a series of nearby rocks, told investigators that the victim had initially been merely thrown there, but the killer, for some unknown reasons, went to change the position of the body.
Looking over the evidence at the time, I felt as if there was some sort of familiarity with some of the circumstances. The victim being found on the banks of a river, the lack of clothing, the cause of death being asphyxiation due to a chokehold, and the fact that he was African American. It was ringing alarms in my head, but at the time I just couldn't figure it out. It was because I couldn't think of anything that I never related the murder of Joseph MacGuffin to those of Charles and Cheryl Wilson. I had no reason to, as those 2 cases shared nothing in common other than the fact that they were both discovered by lakes. I just assumed that it was a coincidence that 2 completely unrelated brutal murders took Bergen County by storm so close together, and the public was already screaming otherwise once the news covered Joseph's murder, but my department and I simply turned a blind eye to what they were saying and treated both the cases separately.
Once again, investigators scoured for any shred of evidence that would indicate someone close to Joseph was a culprit of his murder. However, just as in the case of Charles and Cheryl Wilson, not one person the MacGuffins knew could be considered a suspect. Also, living in an affluent neighborhood and being on the quiet side, the family had no known enemies, and no one had a reason to kill Joseph MacGuffin. As tested by forensic toxicologists, the chemical composition of the red nail polish flakes didn't match the nail polish owned by anyone in the family. And the only UGG boots in their household were owned by the youngest sister, and they were 3 sizes too small. For the second time, investigators were stumped as to where they could possibly go. It was October 13th. Well over a month had passed after the heinous murders of Charles and Cheryl Wilson and Joseph MacGuffin. The atmosphere has settled, and residents throughout the county were a little less weary and wandering about. It was now mid-autumn, and sights were set on the upcoming holiday. Even so, precautionary measures were taken by the police as investigators continued to toil over the few clues they had. With Halloween approaching, it meant that more people would be out and about, possibly more victims of a crime spree that was plaguing the county. However, in spite of the efforts of every police department to cover every bit of the county as they could, and even stretching to neighboring counties, the residents of Hackensack were still taken aback by yet another incident. This time it occurred in view of a witness in the early morning hours in broad daylight.
911, what's your emergency?
I think I just saw someone get killed or just really injured. They were just taken away in a car. It sped off.
Where are you right now? Can you describe what happened?
It's 102 Main Street near the corner. I was just walking and I saw a girl in a car ahead of me and someone with a sling on their arm and a hoodie. I think they might have hit her with a wrench or something and stuffed her in the car. They just drove off a minute ago.
Did you see the license plate? Can you describe the car?
It was too fast. I couldn't see the license plate. It was a small reddish SUV.
This was a major breakthrough in what would soon become one large murder case. Of course, we still hadn't connected the dots between the prior two cases, being a small investigative department with very little evidence to go off of. We had collected mitochondrial DNA from the two hair strands. We tested the chemical composition of the nail polish flecks. Whatever we could do, and from there we couldn't do much. That is until this incident that happened in broad daylight. Based on the witness's testimony, we were searching for a short person in a gray hooded sweater who still had the strength to be able to shove a girl of their same size into the backseat of a car. And also, if the witness was correct, the hooded person had long brownish locks of hair coming from the hood. And again, as investigators, we should never be the ones to assume things, but upon hearing the last fact about the suspect, I just knew that we had been handling all these cases incorrectly.
Deciding to take a rather risky approach, a few investigators from each case banded together to form a small specialized team for the purpose of investigating the murders and the abduction as one whole case. At first, it seemed as if there was no particular modus operandi and that each crime, if committed by the same person, was committed in a completely different fashion. However, after some research, it was discovered that there was indeed one consistency with all three. They were all near exact replicas of serial killer murders that had occurred years prior. The murder of Joseph McGuffin matched those of many of Wayne Williams' victims, and the abduction of the girl by the hooded suspect resembled the method Ted Bundy would use to lure and capture his victims by faking injury. Someone in Bergen County was setting out to copy the hard acts of infamous serial killers, act by act. Investigators cobbled together the evidence they had, as well as the unusual circumstances of each crime, and handed them over to a suspect profiler to make a possible assessment of who to look for.
With the most obvious fact we had was the suspect was female. Mitochondrial DNA taken from the hairs could be found in about 20% of the females, and almost exclusively females. Aside from that, the fact that those hairs were so long and the addition of the flecks of nail polish and UGG prints also supported the idea that she was likely a female. Based on the witness testimony, she was on the shorter side, 4'10" to 5'4", but still strong enough to be able to shove another girl into a car and possibly perform a successful
deadly headlock. She also needed access to a gun or something that could pass as a real gun, a 7-inch knife, the instructions of how to perform a headlock, and a red SUV. Based on just how closely each crime resembled those of prior serial killers, it was safe to say that whoever we're dealing with had a high degree of meticulousness and planned things very carefully. She was also very determined to get things as accurate as possible, even going so far to move one body because she probably didn't like the way it landed by the creek. If she was willing to go this far to make this happen perfectly, she probably had some sort of extreme obsessive nature and held those things in high regard, along with the fact that it was likely that she kept some mementos of at least some of her crimes, and that being of Joseph McGuffin, as his bike wasn't found, that was the gist of what we had. We just needed hopes someone would recognize those pieces.
As soon as a profile was made, it was released to the public. Calls of possible suspects flooded in almost the moment it was seen. People were determined to find the person who had turned the peaceful Bergen County into their own killing grounds. However, despite ever-promising leads, investigators kept hitting wall after wall, finding no connections between the possible suspects and the crimes. That was until they stumbled upon one caller that had a person in mind that was extremely close to what suspect profilers were thinking. Just under 24 hours after the profile had been announced, a call came in from a Bergenfield psychologist about one of her former patients. She was described as a teenage girl who had an extreme obsession with murderers, serial killers, and various infamous criminals. She would often talk extremely highly of them during her sessions. This patient also matched the physical characteristics to the profile nearly to a T. She also seemed to be from a well-to-do but neglectful home, most likely having internet access and possibly a firearm. After requesting to see the patient's record files and the details of each of the 7 sessions the psychologist had with the girl about a year prior, investigators unanimously agreed that the psychological consistencies to the murderer were too close to ignore. It seemed they finally had their suspect. That suspect was Rebecca Harper.
We managed to track the name to an address that was closer to the edge of Bergenfield, and it was there that we set our sights on. And obtaining a search warrant, I took the helm and assembled a small team to head to the house. When we got there, the most immediate thing was the fact that there was a red SUV parked in the driveway. One of my officers went and peeked into it and reported back saying that there appeared to be a small splattering of liquid in the back seat, possibly a bloody impact spatter. That was all the more reason to keep going. So we went to the door and knocked. After a couple of times, we were answered by a woman that was likely our suspect's mother, looking distraught. When we asked about Rebecca Harper, she wasted no time in saying exactly where she was, in the basement. So there we went, only to discover that it was dark and it seemed empty. However, it wasn't silent, as a small radio towards the back was playing some sort of chanting music. We followed the sound, and what we found, I'll never forget about to this day. We found the kidnapping victim and an entire shrine dedicated to the murderers the suspect had copied, including several pieces of evidence from each crime scene. However, we couldn't find Rebecca Harper because she had sprinted out the back door the moment she heard us coming. She didn't get that far.
On your stomach. See your hands.
I am in love with serial killers, so I just wanted to replicate their work. Ever since I was a little girl, I was fascinated with it.
So, how did you choose your victims?
I just follow the same patterns that the other ones did, the other serial killers before me, the gods.
Gods?
Yeah, I see them as gods. They're my idols.
Okay. And do you feel any remorse for your actions?
No, I don't. At all. It was the path I was meant to take.
As soon as Rebecca Harper was in custody, the case of the Bergen County copycat crimes finally unraveled. In her possession were a roll of clothesline that matched the fiber pattern and composition of the clothesline used to tie Charles and Cheryl Wilson. Also the clothes and bicycle she had taken from Joseph McCuffin and the girl she had kidnapped just hours earlier. The mitochondrial DNA taken from the hair strands matched that of her hair, and the chemical composition of the nail polish flakes matched that of a particular bottle of expensive red nail polish she owned. The boot prints at the crime scene matched the soles of a pair of boots she owned as well, which had been washed and stashed away in a small hole in the wall of her basement shrine room. Overall, she matched the exact type of person the investigators had been looking for. After a hasty trial, Rebecca Harper was tried as an adult, and for her uncanny cooperation in the courtroom, was sentenced to life in prison. Her mother, having known exactly what Rebecca was doing and deciding to ignore it, was sentenced to 15 years in prison, both without a chance of parole. As soon as the story got out, the press began to dub the case the Killer Fangirl.